Imagine walking 900 miles in temperatures colder than Mars. No rescue helicopters, no radios, no emergency beacons. Your something went wrong. You didn't call for help. You simply disappeared. Yet in 1910, a group of explorers willingly sailed toward Antarctica, knowing there was a real chance they would never come home. Their goal? Become the first humans in history to reach the South Pole. They believed getting there would be the hardest part. They couldn't have been more wrong. This is the story of the deadliest expedition ever attempted. Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his crew left England aboard a ship called Terra Nova. Thousands of people gathered to cheer them on. To the public, they were heroes before they had even left. But Antarctica doesn't care about heroes. It doesn't care how prepared you are or how badly you want to succeed. It treats everyone the same. The team spent months building supply depots across the frozen landscape. Every bag of food, every gallon of fuel, every piece of equipment had to be dragged across miles of ice by hand. If they misplaced even one cache, it could mean death months later on the return journey, and they had no idea how important those supplies would become. Finally, they began the long march toward the South Pole. At first, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The weather held, the sledges moved steadily, the men were exhausted but optimistic. Then Antarctica reminded them where they were. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees. Strong winds blasted snow into their faces so hard they could barely see. Each breath burned their lungs. Their clothes froze solid. Even eating became difficult because food turned into blocks of ice within minutes. But somehow, they kept moving. Day after day, week after week, every step brought them farther away from rescue and deeper into one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Then something unexpected happened. The ponies they had brought to pull supplies began dying. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others couldn't survive the freezing temperatures. Now the men had to pull hundreds of pounds themselves. Imagine dragging a refrigerator through deep snow for hundreds of miles. That's what every single day became. Yet they refused to turn back, because after everything they'd sacrificed, quitting wasn't an option. Finally, after months of suffering, they saw something on the horizon. A flag. At first, they felt relief. Maybe another member of their expedition had gotten there first, but as they got closer, their excitement disappeared. The flag wasn't British. It was Norwegian. A small tent stood beneath it. Inside, a note. The Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had reached the South Pole more than a month earlier. Scott and his team had lost the greatest race of their lives. After nearly 1,000 miles of suffering, they weren't first. They were second. Imagine risking your life only to realize someone had already won. Most people would have given up. But there was one problem. They still had to make it home. And the journey back would become one of the greatest survival struggles in history. The weather grew even worse. Food began running low. Fuel slowly disappeared. Without enough fuel, they couldn't melt snow into drinking water. Without water, the human body doesn't last long. Then, tragedy struck. One of the explorers, Edgar Evans, became weaker every day. Years of exhaustion, constant injuries, and freezing temperatures finally caught up to him. He collapsed and never got back up. The remaining men continued, not because they thought they'd survive, but because stopping meant certain death. Then another explorer, Lawrence Oates, could barely walk. His feet were destroyed by frostbite. Every step slowed the group down. He knew exactly what was happening. If he stayed, everyone might die. One morning, during another brutal blizzard, he quietly stood up, opened the tent, and said words that would be remembered forever. I'm just going outside, and maybe sometime. Then he walked into the Antarctic storm, alone. He never returned. He sacrificed himself, hoping the others would have a better chance. But Antarctica wasn't finished. Scott and the two remaining explorers pushed forward through constant blizzards. They were starving, freezing, barely able to stand. Then, just 11 miles from a supply depot filled with food and fuel, a massive storm trapped them inside their tent. They waited. One day, then another. The storm never stopped. Eventually, they ran out of food. They ran out of fuel. And finally, they ran out of time. Months later, a search party found the tent buried beneath the snow. Inside, the bodies of Scott and his companions remained exactly where they had died. Beside Scott, they discovered his diary. Page after page described every hardship. They never made it home, but their story did. A century later, we still read Scott's words. We still remember Oates walking into the storm. We still remember men who chose to keep pulling a sled through the worst place on Earth, not because they thought they'd survive, but because they refused to stop trying. That's not a story about losing a race. That's a story about what it means to never give up. If you liked this story, hit subscribe, because the Curious Files brings you more unbelievable true stories like this one every week. Stories that sound impossible,